Welcome to the Power of Disability Language. My name is Miranda Grunwell. I am the Community Education Program Manager at Disability Network Southwest Michigan. My contact information is listed on the first slide. I can be reached at 269-345-1516, extension 120, and my email is grunwellm@dnswm.org. Disability Network Southwest Michigan is one in the network of 15 centers for independent living in the state of Michigan and approximately 400 nationwide. If you are in the state of Michigan, you can find your local center for independent living by going to the Michigan Statewide Independent Living Council website, misilc.org, and click on the resource tab. Or if you are outside of Michigan, you can usually find your local CIL by Googling your state and county name along with the word Centers for Independent Living. This training is brought to you by Disability Network Southwest Michigan, Paving the Way to Self-Determination program. Paving the Way to Self-Determination is a program for families and children with disabilities which help provide resources and trainings to help prepare children to live independent and self-determined lives. Paving the Way to Self-Determination is a collaboration with Michigan Developmental Disability Council, the ARC Michigan, Michigan Alliance for Families, and Charting the Life Course. It is made possible through funding from the Michigan Developmental Disability Council. Before we get started today, I'd like to provide you with a brief definition of what a disability is so that we can have common understanding of the word. The ADA states that a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Major life activities are things like movement, sight, strength, breathing, communication, and decision-making, and so much more. Developmental disability encompasses all of these things as well, but a disability that happens before the age of 22. So it could be someone, a child, born, or sometimes that happens after that effect, a child, but still before the age of 22. As you look at the photo in the slide, you'll see a group of young adults posing for their summer internship at Disability Network. We use this photo because you can't tell that looking at them that most of them have a disability, and actually they all have a disability. This illustrates how disabilities are sometimes non-apparent, meaning that you often don't know that a person has a disability. So to get this conversation started today, I have a question for all of you. Why does language matter? Why are we here today? And why should we be having this conversation? And it's important because as parents and role models for children with disability, it's really important that we use the appropriate words and language around disability. Language is powerful, and language really helps build a person or tear them down. So it's really important for all of us to learn the power of disability language to help our children learn and grow. And so today I'm going to talk about some of those things about why language matters. First, it promotes inclusion. It acknowledges that a person is part of society and all of them, including their disability. It helps reduce stigma, less likely to develop that negative belief about themselves. Society teaches us that it's not a good thing to have a disability, and so having that power and the language to talk about ourselves helps reduce some of that stigma. It also helps foster empathy. More people are likely to be accepting of disability if they hear about disability talked about in a positive way. Another is just starting an open form of communication, making sure that your children feel safe to talk about their disability, to come to you for any questions or concerns that they have, so they know that you are a safe place to come to and have these conversations. It also provides positive self-esteem. It helps our children to learn to grow and be their whole self and their true self, and disability is part of it. It's really hard to separate yourself in that identity. It also just creates a better society. We should all be seen as equal and have the same opportunities in our community, and that includes people with disabilities. And so language is powerful. Language is who we are as a society. Language learns and grows and changes just like everything else in the world does. And language is connected in the disability community back to the independent living movement. During the civil rights movement during the 60s and 70s, people with disabilities were also fighting for their civil rights, just like everybody else was. We probably all have learned about the civil rights movement of people of color fighting for their rights, or the women equality movement. But what we don't usually learn about is people with disabilities at that same time fighting for their rights. We were being denied access to programs and services based off of a characteristic that we did or did not have. And we weren't able to, go to our local schools. If you were a child with a disability, you usually got sent away if you got to go to school at all. You were told that you couldn't live in certain places or work here or do things just because of your disability, and that was legal. And so when in the United States, when we were trying to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, when it passed, it did not include people with disabilities, even though we had asked and were originally in it. Our government took it out, saying that it would make us less competitive in the world markets. And so we had to wait until July of 1990 to get our civil rights passed. And it really wasn't that long ago when we really think about it. 1990. For many of us, we were probably alive, even if we were younger, or we know somebody that was. And so it wasn't like the law that was passed long, long ago. It was pretty recent in retrospect. And we don't learn about these things in school. And so then that means we don't know the history and where that comes from. So language is really powerful, and it's connected to a group of people. Disability is a minority group, and so with any minority group comes language, and it's really up to all of us to learn that language and grow. The image on the screen is 2 black and white photos that illustrate some of the civil rights movement taking place during that time. So next, let's talk about language and how language reveals ableism. Disability is natural. Disability is part of the human condition. Disability is a characteristic, and the language that we use around disability really needs to reflect that. As a society, we tend to think about disability in a negative way, so we tend to talk about it that way. We'll say Bob can't walk versus Bob uses a wheelchair. Miranda can't read versus Miranda uses a screen reader. Both are very neutral. It's saying that somebody uses something versus can't. We all know that disability is not seen as natural. We know this, and our children know this as well. And we can't control the world around our kids, but we can control what happens when we're there and when we're talking about them. I know this is also extremely hard when we're in IEP meetings or when we're advocating for our children to get something. We do need to focus on everything that they can't do to get those services. And that is fine. That is unfortunately how our systems are set up. But in those safe places that all children should have, they should learn to have a good, strong disability identity. Society tells us lots of things, like it's better to be skinny or young or light-skinned and outgoing. That does not make it right. That doesn't mean that anybody is less successful in life because they don't fit that norm. Everybody should be able to be who they are in all of them, in all situations. Language should focus on how somebody does things and how they don't do it. And bullying really today is all about the words that people use. Bullying isn't about, going behind the bleachers and getting beat up. It's really about those words that people use. And so we really need to focus on language and the powerfulness of our language. So now let's get into some examples. So on this slide here, it says disability words are neutral or not. So let's talk about that. The very first one is what's wrong with them, what's wrong with her. And that's usually how we start the conversation is, because you have a disability, that must mean there's something wrong with you. And there is not. There's nothing wrong with anybody with a disability. Having a disability is natural. Having a disability is a characteristic that some people have and some people don't. So let's just say that. What is your disability? Use the word disability. Disability is the preferred word. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's disability history. It's disability pride. There's disability culture. And so we just really need to use that word disability, and don't ask anybody what's wrong with them. If it's none of your business, also don't ask what your disability is. That's really not appropriate, and you should only ask about a disability or disability-related need if it's something that you need to help that person. Then usually what will happen after then you tell somebody about a disability, whether it's your own or your child's, and somebody will say, oh, it's so sad, or oh, I'm so sorry. And there's nothing to be sad or sorry about. Imagine after every time you tell somebody about your disability, or any characteristic about yourself, they say, oh, I'm sad, or that's so sorry, then you learn over time that it's not a good thing. It's something to be sad or sorry about, and something to be shameful. So instead, when somebody says something about their disability, you can say, thank you for sharing. That's really neat. Of course, let me help you with that need. Responding in a positive and neutral way. We also tend to focus on can't a lot when we're talking about people with disabilities. You know, Miranda can't read, Bob can't walk, Susie can't talk. Instead of saying, you know, Miranda uses a screen reader, Bob uses a wheelchair, and Susie uses a communication board. Those are all neutral things because we all use things in our daily life. We just might happen to use something different than what you use, and that's okay. So let's just say that. Miranda uses a screen reader. Can you email that to her? My daughter's going to use her communication device today and talk, and I'm not going to. That's a perfect way of talking about those things. Again, I know as a parent, you do have to talk a lot about what your children can't do to get programs and services. And again, I'm not talking about that at all. You advocate for your children to make sure they get what they need. I'm talking about those conversations that you have with them on a daily basis and just making sure you're letting them know that you see them in a positive way. Next is special needs. Special isn't special. If it was really special, we would all want it. Special is a euphemism that we use, usually by the non-disabled community, to make themselves feel better. So instead, the word is an accommodation. And that's really important for young people to hear that word accommodations, because that is what is used in the working world, is you have, underneath the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have a right to accommodations. You don't have any rights under special needs. Special needs does not exist outside of the school system. So let's just use the word accommodations so our students can start hearing that now and get ready for that in the workforce. Another one we hear a lot of is high and low functioning. That is a lot usually around the autistic community, but not just there. And those are really judgment terms. There's no actual real thing behind those. And so say what you mean. Miranda's going to be joining your class. She's extremely well strength and organization and time management. However, she's going to need to sit in the front row to help with distractions, and she might need a few reminders to stay on task. Perfect. You've described me pretty well as a student and helped that next person be prepared for me to be successful in their classroom. So say what you mean and don't just use low or high functioning, because that can be so different to every individual. The next word is the word impaired. Impaired isn't neutral, but we tend to use it a lot, like hearing impaired or visually impaired and things like that. So instead it would be blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing. Those are all just neutral things. They're diagnoses that people have and not something that is negative there. So language, what I just talked about, is neutral. Being neutral around disability is always the preferred way. But we can take a little bit deeper dive and look at person-first language versus identity-first language. So person-first language, or also some people will call it PFL, puts the person first. So this started in the early 1970s during the independent living movement, and it was really thought to be needed at the time because disability wasn't seen as something that was neutral. It was something that was other. It was cast aside. We were not part of the communities. So as we started learning and growing and being part of these communities, people needed to know that we were people first. And so that's why person-first language really grew during that time. We were seeing what the other movements were doing in the civil rights movement, and they were all creating powerful language to describe them. And so that meant the disability community needed to as well. So the person-first language really thought to eliminate those assumptions about people and really focus on them. Here it's also kind of that secondary part of the person. I can take it, I can set it down and walk away. And so it would be a person with a disability is how you would describe that. Then here are some examples on this slide. If you're still kind of thinking, I'm more of a visual learner, so I'd put a chart here. On the left-hand side is words and phrases that are negative and things we hear quite a bit. And then on the right-hand side is now saying those exact same things, but using that person-first language. So instead of handicapped person or differently abled person, we'd say a person with a disability. Or instead of is Downs, we'd say has Down syndrome. Is learning disabled is has a learning disability. The blind would be a person with blind or low vision. And a normal person would be a person without a disability. That's one that frustrates me the most. Just because you don't have a disability, that doesn't make you normal. That just makes you a person without a disability. So we should just say that. So again, that left-hand side is words and phrases we probably all have heard and said ourselves. And that right-hand side is how we need to start talking about disability in a neutral way so we can build people up and really let them know that they're part of that history and that culture. And we would not be where we are as a society without those contributions. Language is really powerful in that way. Now let's talk about identity first language. Identity first language is really thought to emphasize disability as an identity. Disability is seen as part of the person and something you can't take away. If you took that disability away, then you take that person away. It's kind of the inherent part in that person. And so here we would say disabled person. This started really in the late 1980s as more and more things were growing around the social movement of disabilities, and the social movement being that people don't need to be fixed. It's society that needs to be fixed. So at that time is when the identity first language really started out, and people were like, well, of course I'm a person. I don't need to tell people that. But some groups did feel that way, and so they kept with and kept using identity first language there. So taking that same chart as before, so on the left-hand side are words and phrases that you all have heard. You might have even said them before now, and that's okay. You didn't know any better. And then on that right-hand side are now taking those exact same examples and using identity first language. So instead of handicapped person or differently abled person, it would just be a disabled person. Is Downs would be Down syndrome person. Is learning disabled would be learning disabled person. The blind would be blind person. Brain damaged person would be a brain injury person or brain injury survivor. And a normal person would be a non-disabled person. So again, I took the exact same ones. It's really important that you always take the lead of the person. Now, our youngest children may not have a preference yet, so you can maybe just use both interchangeably. If a person is using person first or identity first language, I would never correct them because they get to decide how they want to talk about themselves because it is their story to tell and it's their journey to share. So just really making sure that we're respectful of that language and we're following their lead and whenever possible, offering to provide those spaces for that language. Here's a slide to talk a little bit more about the language and that visual. So on the left-hand side is person first language or PFL. Then on the other side is identity first language or IFL. And so kind of a visual of that if it helps you like it helps me. I know I needed it when I started this presentation and teaching. The first one was a stick figure person. They're kind of holding a purse out. It's a person with autism. I can set that purse down and I can walk away. Versus autistic person. Here, the head is colored in. And you can't take your head off and walk away. Or in that case, you take part of who you are away. Both are correct. Use both. Here at Disability Network Southwest Michigan, we use both of them interchangeably as much as we can. Always making sure you take the lead of the person and letting them decide what they want. I do want to note that there is a strong majority preference in some groups. So for example, within the adults with developmental disabilities, they do have a strong preference for person first language because they feel like they're still fighting for that. But then in the mental health community, there's actually a push to use person first there as well. And so it really just depends on the group, and it's okay as long as you're using neutral language overall. That's what's really important. And just using both when you can, you know, and within the same story or sentence that you're talking about, depending on what it is. Just trying that out would be a great practice if you'd like to practice some language there. And so about language. Language isn't about being too sensitive, political correctness, or some people will say, Miranda, I can't keep up. It changes all the time. I'm not trying to offend you. What's the big deal? Or the latest comment we got is Americans are just getting soft. Language isn't about any of these things. Language is about seeing and recognizing a group of people and who we are and our history and our culture and how we want to be talked about. Language is powerful, really powerful. We can build a person up and tear them down simply by the words that we use for them and how we talk about them. Saying something, you know, well, it's not trying to offend you. Well, it does. In that case, if it happens, apologize and learn it so you can do better next time. Just don't keep doing the same thing over and over again. Language is powerful. Language builds. And it's really, really important that we do that and change with it. As language changes, Webster Dictionary updates often, and so language gets to update as well. I don't think we're getting soft as Americans. I actually think we're learning and growing and doing so much better. I've been teaching disability language for over 20 years now, and I've seen so many great changes within our community here, and so I'm just really grateful for that and the learning that we'll continue to learn and grow as a society together. I would like to do an opportunity to take a little quiz here, just so you can quiz yourself to see how well you think you're doing on language. So another chart here on the left-hand side is words and phrases that you probably all have used around disability in that negative way, where on the right-hand side is those blanks that we're going to fill in together. And so if you wanted to pause this training and fill that in, you can. If not, I will move forward with the answers now, so you have that as well. So the first one is handicapped person or differently abled person. That would just be a person with a disability or non-disabled person. And so just language is making sure that we're using the word disability in a person with a disability or disabled person. Disability is the word, and that is what we want to use. So then you might be saying, hey, Miranda, if we're not using the word handicap anymore, what do I call parking or bathrooms? And it's accessible. Things are accessible. It's how they're designed. It's an accessible bathroom. It's an accessible parking spot. And it lets people with disabilities know that space that they can use. The next one we want to talk about is able-bodied person or normal person. And that is would be a non-disabled person or a person without a disability. Both are correct. If you can be a person with a disability, you can be a person without. Both of those are the neutral. Just because you don't have a disability doesn't mean that you're normal. That's really hurtful for many people with disabilities. Another common one is wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. It's just a wheelchair user or has a wheelchair or needs a wheelchair. A wheelchair is movement, it's freedom, it's access. And so making sure that we talk about disability in that way. Not having a wheelchair is actually what's bound and confining. Not having access to that wheelchair to get to your community is actually where that is, and not the wheelchair itself. Another one is that's crazy or that's insane. Here we could say something like, wow, no way, outrageous. Crazy isn't crazy anymore. If it's the crazy gunman, it's the crazy person. And so we really need to think about the mental health community and people and how that has been used against them. Even historically, the word crazy has been used against people with disabilities in many negative ways. Next is the word special or a special accommodation. Special isn't special. If it was, we would all want it. So we just need to use the word accommodation. And we talked about that in a previous slide. It's an accommodation. It's an accommodation that we're allowed to have because we have a disability. That means we're allowed to have accommodations in school and in work, so that way we can be part of our community. The last example I have on here today is the word disability, but the word dis is little case and ability is uppercase. And it's not. It's just the word disability. Don't uppercase it or lowercase it any differently than you would any other word. Just by making something little case or lowercase, it doesn't change it at all. Disability isn't a bad word, so we don't need to change how we write it to represent that. So we should just use the word disability. I use a capital D for pride. You don't necessarily have to. If you want to learn more about disability pride, we do have another training on here for parents to teach their children about disability pride. So just use the word disability, and that is the preferred term within the community. Next, I want to talk about some microaggressions that we do see. So some places where we see these language that is used. So microaggressions are kind of these tiny sub things that people say, probably without even realizing it. And they probably don't really mean anything by it, but over time that can cause that harm when it relates to language and helping our young people really build that self-esteem that they need. We can do that by eliminating some of these microaggressions and things that we say. So example of using the word like blind as a negative or an insult, is that referee blind? That was a foul. Well, the referee probably isn't blind, and whether that was a foul or not, that we shouldn't be using that word blind in that scenario. Or what are you, stupid? Stupid is used a lot for people with disabilities and to describe us, and never in a positive way. And so we shouldn't be talking about the word stupid in there. Or one, have you tried yoga? And this is really that unsolicited advice. When sometimes when people see somebody with a disability, they'll ask me, well, have you tried acupuncture? Have you tried yoga? Have you tried, and they'll list many things. More than likely, we probably have. It's different if I were to say to you, hey, could you help me I'm looking for ideas to help with pain management. I'm asking you, and that's very different than you just being like, oh, you're in chronic pain all the time? You need some ice packs, and making that unsolicited advice. The next one is using the word OCD when you don't know if somebody actually is or yourself. A common thing we'll hear is, I like things neat and clean. I'm so OCD. And not everybody with OCD is neat and clean. There's a lot of comprehension and different things part of that. And so just making sure we're not using a disability where it's not needed. Or saying, ugh, I can't read this. I'm so dyslexic, is a way of thinking of that too. Dyslexic used in that way. Or one that says, look me in the eyes when you're talking to me. Looking in the eyes for some people with disabilities is really hard to do. And so, not knowing that people don't have to look at you in the eyes always necessarily to talk to you and understand, which we all know. The next one is using the R word, which is retard. There's a big campaign in the 90s called Shred the Hate, Shred the R word. And so I'm just going to refer to it as the R word from here. But using R word in a negative way. And so instead we could just really say what we mean. I'm really frustrated. This isn't fair. We hear it in music in lots of places, the R word, but it's our job to stop using that in our normal everyday language and give way for some new options to use. And then the last one is praying for a person without asking for them. We should never assume that a person needs prayer without asking or getting their permission. People with disabilities live big, full, comprehensive lives like everybody else. And so our prayer needs are probably usually nothing to do with our disability. It could be a fact that we have a kid learning to drive. We're getting ready to go on vacation again. Or, worried about many different things that we would have prayer requests for. But don't assume that disability is one of them. And so you need to ask and make sure that's appropriate before doing that.
Remember that change often happens gradually, and it may not always be possible to change people's language and everyone around you. However, consistently model neutral language around disability. Know that it does have important impact on those around you, and over time, you may find more people are willing to adapt and include inclusive language as they become aware of its importance. There's several ways that we can accomplish this. One is by leading by example. Continually use neutral language around disability, and others will over time may see that and then follow suit. You can also educate gently. If someone is using inappropriate language around disability, you can gently give them an example of what they can do instead. So for example, if somebody says that person is wheelchair bound, you could respond with, actually, it's more accurate to say that person uses a wheelchair. And people then will understand and can make that change. You can also explain the impact. Sometimes people don't know or aren't aware of the negative impact that their language can have. You can calmly explain to them why using neutral language is important. For example, you could say, using first-person language is more respectful because it emphasizes that a person is not just their disability. Again, people don't understand what they don't know, and so you could explain to them why. Use personal examples whenever you can. Hey, that hurts me because, or my child doesn't like it when you use the phrase blank, and it can help them with that. Also share resources. There's many different resources there are available about neutral language. There's books and websites and articles. You can also refer them back to this presentation and their local disability network to get additional information on resources they can use. It's also important to engage in conversation when it's appropriate. It's not always available and you have the time to, and that's okay. When you can, have a conversation. Share your perspective. Share your child's perspective about the importance of language and why and how it's important to change. It's really important to be patient. Remember, change takes time. It's hard to change a habit we have, and language is habit. So be patient and be encouraging, and also offer and just know it's okay. but progress is slow. And as long as people are moving in the right direction, that's good. And of course, whenever possible, lead with positive reinforcement. Encourage people that, hey, I noticed that you've been using more neutral language. I want to thank you for that. And just provide that positive reinforcement. People are going to keep trying if they realize that you notice that they're making a really good change. The image on this slide is of an adult reading a book to a child, and the child is wearing glasses.
I did provide some additional learning resources on this slide, so if you wanted to keep learning and growing about disability, we really recommend that you do that. We have the National Center on Disability and Journalism, which has a very good style guide to help with writing. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network article on identity first language. Disability Natural is Natural as a person first language person first resource. Really helpful there. My Body is Not an Apology, and that is about identity first versus person first language. So if you want to learn more about those too, strongly recommend that article. It's really great. Another article on the R word. So if you're like, hey, Miranda, I'm not really sure what you're using or talking about, we have an article on slide 17 so you can learn more about that. We also have a neurodiversity slide, which has some basic terms and information there. It's an amazing presentation and information there from them. And then also Forbes has some good resources too on disability etiquette. So we strongly encourage you to check those out when they're available. I also, again, just would like to thank our partners. We have the Centers for Independent Living. We have their address, the Michigan Developmental Disability Council, Michigan Alliance for Families, the ARC, and the Charting the Life course. So once again, just really want to thank all of our sponsors and allowing this training to happen today, and so I could be with all of you. And my very last slide just says questions, comments, Disability Network Southwest Michigan. Again, my name is Miranda Grunwell, and if you have any questions or anything I can help with, please reach out to me. It's best to reach me on email, which is grunwellm@dnswm.org. Thank you for hanging out with me today, and hope you have the rest of your day.